While the Afterwards podcast is taking a break for the next several weeks, we will feature interviews with nonfiction authors from C-SPAN's Book TV. On this episode, Who Believed in You? How Purposeful Mentorship Changes the World, with the authors Republican Senator Dave McCormick, Republican of Pennsylvania, and his wife, Dina McCormick, who was Deputy National Security Advisor in the first Trump administration. They talked with influential people, including fashion leader Tory Burch, Hollywood producer Brian Grazer, Governor Sarah Huckabee Sanders, Republican of Arkansas, and Wes Moore, Democrat of Maryland, among others, to learn how mentors helped shape their lives. Fred Ryan, chair of the Reagan Foundation and director of the Center for Civility and Democracy, talked with the authors in March about their book and their careers. Next week on this podcast, Jose Andres and his book, Change the Recipe, because you can't build a better world without breaking some eggs.
One reason we're really excited about this is that we've launched this Center on Civility and Democracy, and the idea is in a very nonpartisan way to try to address the divisions and the separations that we see in our country. And some of our research has shown that people are alienated and they feel unappreciated, and some of that's because of the digital era we live in. People are simultaneously the most connected they've ever been, but at the same time the loneliest they've ever been. And it's about the need for relationships, and what relationships are better than mentorships. So we're happy to be able to have the chance to talk to two of you about this. And a couple questions just to get started. First off, whose idea was it to do this book?
Definitely is.
Okay.
Definitely is.
And my next question was, who worked the hardest on the book?
Definitely me.
I'm trying to get some I'm trying to get some tension in here.
Definitely me.
Oh, it's coming.
Well, okay. To get into the book, you started off with a story about a young guy in Hollywood who gets an appointment with a big Hollywood mogul, trying to really form a relationship. And while they're talking, this mogul's pet bird dies and drops on the floor, but somehow it all worked out okay.
Yes.
Tell us that story, please, Dina.
Sure. Can everyone hear me? Well, first of all, Fred, thank you so much for having us. And Roger, it is such an honor to be here at the Ronald Reagan Institute. It's the very first event for the book. So we don't know how this is going to go, but I'm really, really proud to be here and be with so many friends. The Zackheims and Secretary Chow, Ambassador, thank you for being here, and too many friends to thank, Adrian and Jean and others. It's actually, just very quickly, I will say, the fact that you all have honored President Reagan's legacy the way you have is so compelling. And frankly, Fred Ryan, John Rogers, and Roger and others really deserve so much credit. You really have continued his legacy in an extraordinary way.
Thank you.
So we started this book, and we'll get to the Hollywood producer, during COVID. Dave and I have 6 daughters between us. And we spent a lot of time with them during COVID, and we realized that beyond missing really seminal moments, that generation lost so much more, not just high school graduations or proms. It was human connectivity, and it was a really important time in their life, you know, when all of us began our careers and had mentors to look up to. And so we started asking them how important they valued it, and we were a little worried they didn't totally know what we meant. And so we started asking people, who was your mentor? And we were, of course, lucky enough to get to ask Satya Nadella and Condoleezza Rice and Tory Burch and Dr. Motley. And it actually accidentally turned into a book. I'll let you tell the Brian story, though.
Dina definitely did more of the work. I just want to give it this. So it was, we had both benefited from mentors who had changed our lives, which we'll talk about in a minute. Just a couple key people that made all the difference. And so when we started to ask people about this, we asked Brian Grazer, who is a very well-known Hollywood producer. He won the Oscar for Beautiful Minds. He's a great friend. His wife went to high school, my high school in Bloomsburg, Pennsylvania, if it's a small world. And so he told us this incredible story where he was a scrappy guy who was kind of a runner at one of the big studios. And he eventually wrote 2 screenplays. And he was trying to pitch these screenplays all around Hollywood. And he finally got a meeting with Deanne Barkley, who was the most prominent woman in Hollywood at the time and was the executive vice president of a major studio. And so he goes into pitch her, and he starts to pitch her. He has two scripts. He's pitching on both scripts. And there's a canary behind her in the bird cage. And in the middle of his pitch, it drops over dead. And she looks at him and he looks at her and they both pause and it's this very awkward moment. And then she burst out laughing. And she says, what a moment, like something's going on here, something special. I'm gonna buy both scripts. And the two scripts were Splash and Night Shift, both of which became major hits. But the thing about this relationship that was so special is she sort of took him on as her project and to help him navigate Hollywood. He had no real formal training. This was a career in its infancy. And she kept getting him in front of the most important people in Hollywood, and the meetings would not go that well. And so this happened a number of times, and she finally pulled him aside and she said, you know, I've listened to these meetings, I've followed up on them. The problem is you exaggerate. You overstate the case. People think you're lying. And so you start strong, but then you lose your momentum, and nobody wants to follow up on it. So you got to be much more forthright and it just hit him like a wave, and it totally changed the way that he thought about his projects and his professional approach. And he's an extremely precise person now in terms of how he talks about what he's doing and how he's doing it. And he said it was one of those moments where there's a fork in the road, and that changed everything. And that's one of many stories that we came across where someone took an interest in someone early in their life and career, and it changed everything. The book is about the people that changed everything. But it's not about the famous people. There's a lot of famous people mentioned in the book. It's about the people you never heard of that were the giants on whose shoulders these famous, most influential people were able to rise. And that's the headline, which is, we can all change the world just by helping others realize their full potential.
And I want to come back to some of the other examples you had, because there are some great stories of people. But one thing, Dave, you did was you gathered data for this. You commissioned a survey about the value of mentorship, which may be the only one that's been done like this. What did you learn from that survey?
Do you want to take that one? So we talked to Jeff Sonnenfeld, who is a friend of both of ours, and we Morning Consult. Right. And the two of them teamed up, and we had a couple researches, and we asked for them to do a bunch of survey work on mentorship. And you could see really fundamental gaps between those people that found mentors and how it changed their course, and those who didn't. It was really, there was differences across women, across how people ingested mentorship. But the key things that jumped out of it were sort of 4 building blocks that made all the difference in effective relationships. One was trust, where the mentors built trust with the mentees, and you trusted that you were all on the same team, that you could really confide and they would have your best interest in mind. The second was commitment, because you had to have a commitment on both sides of the relationship to make it work. And we talk a lot about the different ways. Dina's had a lot of experience mentoring people in the different ways that can be successful. There was confidence building, because part of mentorship is helping people try things and failing, and learning from that failure. So there were some basic principles and values. The final thing was values, where transformative mentorship relationships are about helping people not just transactionally become, executive vice president, but how to become leaders and people that are going to change the world. And that's what the most effective relationships did.
There was a big difference between women and men. Men, and this was 1,200 people, so it was the largest survey of mentorship. And men wanted to have mentors, and they liked to find mentors that had power and influence. Women wanted to find mentors that were authentic and that were actually going to give them real feedback and invest in them. And so it turns out men have more mentors than women do, because women are a little anxious to ask people to serve in that role.
And this distinction between transactional and transformative. Transactional would be if you say, help me get a job, but yes. Transformative is they develop you over years and more dimension. Is that how
yes.
you just define?
And that even came out through the data. Who were the meaningful mentors? Obviously, we all had mentors that helped us professionally. But the people that change your life, the people that help you find your purpose, are those people that really invested in you over many, many years, are willing to also give you the tough love. That was something that really came out through the stories. To be an effective mentor, caring enough to share constructive feedback, to actually say when you messed up and doing it in a nice way. And we'll get into John Rogers here in a minute because he was a very big mentor of mine and helped us develop these incredible programs. But the CEO of Goldman Sachs, Lloyd Blankfein, was a very important mentor of mine for many years. And every time I'd say, "You're such a good mentor," he'd say, "You mean mentor?" and actually, yes, is the answer. But I learned a lot.
So let's talk a little bit about those programs, because one question comes up: can a mentor more than one person at a time? And with 10,000 small businesses, 10,000 women, 1 million black women, that's a lot of people involved. How much was mentoring part of those programs that you led?
Well, we really didn't start out, honestly, with the concept that mentoring would emerge as so critical. These were economic development programs empowering entrepreneurs by providing business education, capital, and mentoring and networking. And we learned that, especially for the female entrepreneurs, it was critical to have a business advisor, to have somebody that would look over your business plan to really help you. And really, it was a confidence thing to have somebody invest. We had an entrepreneur, I remember well, in Egypt. She had a company called Pink Taxis, where she hired female drivers. They only had female passengers, and it was growing, and her husband disapproved of it. He didn't think she should work or have a job or be an entrepreneur. Suddenly, she started making money, and he became the COO. But it was the confidence
which I'm sympathetic to. Being
it was the confidence of the Goldman Sachs mentor at that time that told her, "You can do this." And by the way, now actually Uber is looking to buy Pink Taxi.
Fantastic. Dave, a question for you. In your years at West Point, in the Army, in combat, mentoring has got to be an important part of that culture. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, I was thinking about that question. Mentoring and leadership are close cousins, because you got to have value. Great leaders are values-based. Great leaders commit themselves to the people for whom they're leading. They build confidence. But the difference, I think, of what we're describing is something where it's very personal and you're vested. You can't do that many transformational mentorship relationships at one time because they require a level of emotional engagement. And the key thing about it, I think what Dina and I both experienced, is they get to know you enough where they can often see things in you that you can't see in yourself. And they get to know you enough that they can tell you things that no one else can tell you. And in my case, a person that sort of changed my life was a football coach who, when I was a sophomore in high school, I was kind of a mediocre football player. I was kind of mostly rode the bench. And the coach got fired, and a new coach came in, and he watched all the films from the preceding year when I would get pulled in on like the fourth quarter and get to a couple plays. And he called me over the summer, and he said, "I see something. I think you can be really good. I think you've got talent." And so he really encouraged me, and out of nowhere, he kind of made me the co-captain of the football team a junior year. That seems like such a small thing, I know. That changed how I thought about myself. And I went on, I had a great football career. I was all-state linebacker, and that was part of why I went to West Point. And I remember like it was yesterday, the first day of West Point, where the superintendent comes in and says, "How many people here were first in their class?" And all these hands go up. "How many people here were class president?" And my hand's not going up. And how many people were, and then at fourth, fifth, he said, "And how many people were captain of the football team?" And my hand went up. And that would have never happened. He saw something that I didn't see. And the same happened for Dina. She could tell her story. But that only happens if you invest enough time in the person. You can't do that as a leader of 100 people. You can't do that for 100 people. But if you invest the time and the commitment and the energy and the care, you can really do that for a handful of people at a time, and that can really have huge benefits.
And did you carry through during your time in the Army? Were you mentoring people?
Yeah, I really tried to. We talk about the mentor. Dina has much more success in mentoring many people, but along the way, there's in fact, I say a young man. He's not young. We're not young anymore. But there was a guy who was General Petraeus' aide in Iraq who became a White House fellow and became a gentleman who worked for me when I was at the Treasury Department. And sometimes you're doing this and you don't even know you're doing it. And so he and I would go running every morning on the mall, and we'd talk about everything, his career, and he had been a great been a great soldier, and I had some influence on him, I think. And he later told me that relationship, he's now the head of the leadership department at West Point, he's a colonel, and he said that relationship really changed his life. And you don't know, and I know Dina's had that impact on many people.
Well, that was one thing I wanted to ask when you said sometimes you're doing it and you really don't even know you're doing it, but what are the rules to being a mentor? Does someone have to say, I am officially your mentor, I am your mentee, here's our duration, here's the expectation? How does that happen?
C-SPAN's Afterwards podcast continues in a moment. Now back to C-SPAN's Afterwards podcast.
I think it's a little more organic, although we do talk about being purposeful and deliberate about seeking out mentors. But a lot of times you don't realize that you're doing it. I'll just share one story that's in the book, and that was on President Trump's first trip abroad. I was working in the National Security Council, and we were in Brussels. This was after Riyadh and Jerusalem, and we're sitting there, and he's about to meet President Macron. And the deputy protocol woman from the NSC had to brief him, and she was very nervous about briefing him. And I was seated at the table, and it was the Secretary of Treasury and State and NSC and everyone, all men. And I realized that she really had to get his attention. So I just stood up and I said, why don't you brief him? Sat down, it went well. President Trump loved her, and that turned into a great, eventually she was promoted. And many months later, she wrote me a card, and she said, you literally gave me your seat at the table. And that just made me think about that this was a bigger deal, how I presented, et cetera. And then, of course, that turned into a big mentoring relationship. A favorite mentee of mine is Genevieve Ryan, I do want to say, who I had the privilege of working with, and she was such a dynamo, and I'm not just saying this because Fred is here and Ginny is here. I mean, she really excelled, and it was in the fire, so to speak, at that time.
Well, you were terrific with her, and she would be here, but she's due with a baby in 4 weeks, and today is her 8th-month checkup, so she couldn't be here this evening, but she appreciated your mentorship, Dina.
Yeah, thank you.
You're talking about your work in the NSC, and let me talk a little bit about somebody who's been a leader in foreign policy, Condoleezza Rice. You mention her in the book, and she's obviously well known by many of us here. She's a trustee of the Reagan Foundation, but you tell her story. What's the lesson in Condi Rice's story?
Well, she tells a few things that she'd actually never shared before, which is just remarkable. Her story starts, of course, in Birmingham, Alabama, and she eventually went to the University of Denver, and she thought she was going to be a classical pianist until she went to the Aspen Music Festival, and she realized some 12-year-olds were a little better than her. And so she said, uh-oh. And then she thought she was going to be a city planner, and she didn't really love that. So she had a professor who she took a class on foreign relations, and this professor saw something in her, and it really is what led to her getting her PhD, going into national security. And that professor happened to be Madeleine Albright's father. From Czechoslovakia, and he saw something in her, and she writes in the book she was almost scared to ask him for what she should do in the next steps. She was a very important mentor to me, and I'll share this story. After 9/11, when we would travel around the world, and a lot of time in the Middle East, we were actually one time in a capital in the Middle East with a very senior leader. And it was a tough time after 9/11, and the leader said to her, I hope you didn't come to preach at me, Madam Secretary, about democracy or whatever. And she's tough. I thought, how's she going to handle this? And I think he wasn't ready to see a black female Secretary of State, to be honest, at that time. And she said, well, Your Highness, how could I ever come preach to you when not that long ago my own country counted me as 3/5 of a man? But the difference between my country and yours is we're on an imperfect journey, and we're going to get there faster than you because we believe in human rights and dignity. That shut him up pretty quick. I want to state for the record, since Ambassador Alateba is here, it was not the UAE.
Dave, a question I wanted to ask you, as we've talked a little bit about, we live in a time where there is such distrust of institutions, distrust of our fellow citizens. And you write in the book, mentoring offers the pathway for solving the fundamental deficit of trust in the United States. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, it's like sometimes it seems overwhelming. I'm sure people feel that because there's so much discord.
Right.
There's so much polarization in society. And there really is, by all accounts, if you look at the data, people trust institutions less. They trust the media less. They trust the church less. They trust public officials less. There's a trust deficit. It's sort of a well-documented trust deficit. So, you start with like, how do you solve this problem? It seems so overwhelming. And the answer, at least one part of solving it, we think, is starting at the bottom, not the top, which is just an organic commitment to helping the next person like you were helped. It's the notion of paying it forward. What a difference you can make in somebody's life. And you don't have to be a famous person. You don't have to be a senator. You don't have to be in one of these positions of power to have a huge impact on the next generation. And we're at a moment where we need to build up that next generation. And we very purposely and intentionally pick people from across different, the David Chang, the famous chef, or Brian Grazer, or Republicans and Democrats, Wes Moore, Sarah Huckabee, Condoleezza Rice. That's very intentional, because this is something that should transcend our differences. And our future really depends on that next generation being able to close that trust gap, and values-based leaders that are working to develop the next generation. That seems like something most of us should be able to agree on.
Yes. Well, speaking of developing next generation, in almost every story you told, one or both parents played a role in mentoring their child. Can you talk about the role of parents as mentors?
Well, it is interesting, of course, and obvious, the influence that moms and dads have. In many cases in the stories, dads had a particular influence on their daughters. Certainly Condi's, Tory Burch, that was her big mentor. Sarah Huckabee had two mentors, her dad, obviously, and she tells a very nice story about President Trump. But they really do kind of play that like confidence, that very beginning confidence role. And I'm going to put you on the spot to tell Dave, let's just say Dave's parents really believed in him. Like, even when things didn't look so good, they really did believe in him. In fact, I was walking in today, and I thought, no one but your mom would want to see such a big picture of your face. But she would, and she did, and she always loved it. But you have to tell the story about the thing they told you last week, or a couple weeks ago.
Oh, yeah. But my mom and dad, my dad is like hard, tough love. Sometimes the love is very carefully hidden behind the tough. And my mom, and they were on the campaign trail, very, very actively involved. And my dad's a bigger-than-life personality, real role model. But recently, with all the votes on the Senate, we've been going around the clock. You're going 30 hours. And if you're in the majority, then the majority presides. So as it turns out, the new people, the junior people, get the worst assignments of when you're presiding. And so a couple weeks back, I had the 6 a.m. slot, and then I had the 9 p.m. slot. And as it turned out, the 9 p.m. slot was where all the action was happening. There was like 10 votes. The Senate floor was full, and it was a lot of order. I was tapping the order. People, it was very chaotic. And I got back to the hotel at about 10:30 that night, and my phone rings. It's my mom and dad on speaker. We saw you. We saw you. And my dad said, "Did you get promoted?" And I said, no, Dad, it's not that way. It's like a rotation, and it's a bad thing, not a good thing. And my mom, with confidence you could only have as a mother, said, they wouldn't put you up there unless you were doing very well. So they believed in me.
Yes, and
sure.
Still do. That's right.
Just to come back a little bit what you said in the survey, where there were different results from men and women, and you talk in the book about the importance of cross-gender mentoring, men mentoring women and women mentoring men. Why is that important?
Well, particularly in male-dominated industries. I mean, obviously, finance is one of those, and you have to have a male mentor when it's a male-dominated industry, because they have a different perspective and they, give you different feedback, obviously. And like I said, I got a lot of feedback from John and David and Lloyd along the way. But it's also interesting because I remember being in a meeting. I'll give you an example with an amazing woman that worked with me, and we were pitching a client for a big IPO. And she had worked so hard, and the deck was perfect, and she went in and she just crushed it. She had this tiny little mistake. I mean, not even anything that resonated. And the guys who had not prepped so well, to be honest with you, were high-fiving each other. We got the client, and we walked out, and she was just heartsick, and she kept replaying it in her mind, the one little tiny thing. And one of the men said, see, men don't do that. Men don't look back. Men don't think, what could I have done differently? That is going to make you less successful. You always have to look forward, even if you've made a mistake. And that was such a great message to her.
Great. What are the qualities, if someone were to select a mentor, if someone in a younger age is looking for someone, or if you're a mentor looking for a mentee, could you say what you want to find on each side to make that match the right match?
I don't think so. You know, one of the things that's most interesting is how different the mentors are across the personalities, and they come at different times. You need different things in your life, and while you can be purposeful about it, it does happen in a very organic way. And you know, just to give you an example of that, even unlikely mentors, David Chang is, you may know that name, but a very prominent chef, has a Momofuku, has created this real network. And his mentor early on was Anthony Bourdain.
Wow.
Who helped him and gave him advice. And over time, their paths diverged a bit, and Anthony was pursuing a lifestyle which was going to make it very hard if David stayed on that same path to have children and kind of the life he wanted. And in some ways, the end of Anthony Bourdain's life, which ended very sadly, was a lesson on how not to pursue a career of fame and success on that same manner. So at different times, different people can help in different ways. And we also talk about the fact it's okay for mentorships to end. This isn't a lifelong commitment. Like, there's different moments that where someone may really play a meaningful role in your life, and it's equally, by the way, equally meaningful to both sides. You know, the mentor takes a lot of satisfaction out of this too. So this isn't a one-way street. And I guess the one thing I wanted to say to everybody here, the one theme that came out over and over again was people remembering, as they were talking about their mentor, whether they said thank you.
C-SPAN's Afterwards podcast continues in a moment. Now back to C-SPAN's Afterwards podcast.
And Christine Lagarde, who's profiled in the book, you know, we had a great discussion with her, and there was a couple people that really changed her life. She was extremely successful in the legal profession before she went into public policy, and there was a woman who ran her firm who made all the difference. And Christine Lagarde, as she was telling us the story, paused and almost got emotional and said, you know, I never told her. I never told her how much she meant to me. I never told her that she made all the difference. So for all of you who still have your mentors with us, you know, tell them.
Say thanks.
Say thanks, yeah.
We're going to have a chance for questions from the audience, and I'm going to call actually on someone who was mentioned in the book to maybe, Eric, I don't know, to tell a little about your experience in mentoring. But first, how about, well, actually, let's get a question first. I see Adrienne has her hand up.
Do you want me to wait for Eric?
She's got a microphone for you. Here.
Well, I particularly like your discussions on gender, and for all my 83 years, I've always basically been the only woman in the room. And so I think a lot about what you were saying. I tend to think in terms of dominant and non-dominant. So that can apply in many areas, but the issues, shall we say, become the same. But on gender, you're totally right. There is such a great difference. And I would ask the consideration of the word sponsor. I think of women having mentors, it's shared all equal. But to move forward, you need a sponsor who will commit to who you are. And men are easily ask somebody, could you introduce me to so-and-so or something like that? Women will not. The other side of it is that when you ask somebody for something, you incur a debt. And women are debt averse, as you know, from they don't borrow money. They'd rather rent the warehouse than borrow money. So it's kind of a double-edged thing where mentorship, but the idea of cross-gender, I don't know that that's the word today, but is extremely important. And the idea, I basically say I won't mentor women. They know what I think on things. I mentor men or sponsor men because I see the world through a different lens. But the other part of this, the downside, again, it's gender, is, or should I say the key three-letter word, sex, is, it's there.
I don't think do we have a chapter on that? We don't have.
No.
A business trip, and I went on my first business trip with my boss. I was the first woman in the entire airline industry to be in this field, and he tried to come up to my room after the dinner. I said no, and he set out to fire me, and eventually he did. But the difficulty, and the valid difficulty, where you have male sponsors or male bosses taking a female under his wing.
That does actually come up. You're right, Adrienne. Frankly, it is so important. I remember you picked Ann Korologos because you wanted a woman to be your mentor in the fellows program, right?
Yeah, if you're a man, I think, and particularly if you're going to be in leadership positions where you're working with lots of women as well, to have a woman mentor is a huge, advantage. And I sought out Ann Korologos, who I'm sure many in this room know, who's just a wonderful person, and she wasn't so sure she was up for this, and so she had me come over, and I kind of interviewed, and she said, okay, let's have coffee again sometime, and we became great friends, and she was a source of advice and insight for many years, and as you know, she was the only woman in the room for a long time. In many industries and in government, and I think it's a huge benefit.
And for
to
President
a man.
Reagan, that's right.
We mentioned Eric, who many of us know is in the book, and we're going to kind of put him on the spot and tell a little bit about your experience, Eric.
You're very fortunate if you have one mentor. You're extremely blessed if you have more than one mentor. I think I had a neon sign over my head that said, "This kid needs help." And David and Dina gave me the privilege of talking about 6 mentors, and I will not do that here, but there were 2 in particular that had a transformative impact on my life. In this small, rural African-American town that I grew up in, my grandparents adopted me, and they were not biologically my grandparents, and they wanted me to have an education, a good education. And the teacher wrote a note back to my grandparents informing them that I had been demoted from the rabbits to the turtles. And she's not one to be prejudiced, but she knew the difference. And she called the only person in our rural community who had gone away to graduate school, who was a retired teacher who she thought could help rehabilitate me.
This is Aunt Shine, right?
Aunt Shine.
Yeah.
And her name was Emma Madison Bell, but we called her Aunt Shine because everywhere she went, light followed. And she was extremely stout in faith, and principle, and physique. And it was her task to restore me to reading. And at age 7, she brought her material to the house, and it was a copy of the U.S. Constitution and the Declaration of Independence. And she had me to memorize the entire Declaration of Independence because she felt that this was truly my right as a citizen and my liberation through education. And that had I became a rabbit again. I became a rabbit again. And then I had this university president who just found me and knew my interest in ideas and introduced me to Aristotle and T.S. Eliot and Auden and opened my mind to Greek literature. And he had such an enormous impact on me, Fred, that I decided to get a PhD because I wanted to become a university president. And that influence is so lasting. And the last person I'll just make note of is those are people that you'll never read about or know, but who in their own quiet way lived their lives virtuously and are in unremembered graves. But the one that you might know is Walter Isaacson, who Dina introduced me to when she was my boss. And Walter moved me 2 doors down from him at the Aspen Institute. And when he was working on Einstein or Leonardo da Vinci or Steve Jobs. He would come into my office. He would allow me to read the manuscripts. And then he encouraged me to write my book and decided to write the foreword and insisted that he could only have a party here in Washington, D.C. if it was a joint party. And it was Eric Motley and Leonardo da Vinci. And what was most beautiful and touching about Walter, as so many of you know, is that one day he was going home to New Orleans, and he took a detour, and he drove to Madison Park, this little African-American community in Montgomery, Alabama, and he visited my grandparents' graves and the house that I grew up in, and he sent me photographs. And at the end, it's about relationships, experiences, and memories. Yeah.
And just to not interrupt this too much, but Walter's in the book. And Walter, growing up in rural Louisiana, had a mentor named Uncle Walker. Uncle Walker took an interest in him. They would fish together. They would talk about life, he was not an actual uncle. He was the father of, or the uncle of a friend of his. And about halfway through the chapter, you discover this is Walker Percy, who won the National Book Award, was an incredibly distinguished writer who inspired Walter to pursue a career in journalism, possibly in fiction. Walter worked on a steamboat one summer and tried fiction. Fiction didn't. He's got a novel somewhere in a drawer that he never published, but then became, I think, arguably the greatest biographer of our generation. And Uncle Walker was the inspiration.
Amazing. Well, thank you for sharing your story, Eric, and thank you for including it in the book. It's such a wonderful story. We're going to go upstairs in just a minute where we get to sign the books, but I have a question for each of you. Who believed in you?
So, like Eric, it was hard to pick because I've been blessed with so many mentors, as I talk about in the book. One that is not as known to be a mentor of mine, and Senator Blunt and Abby know her well, and so does Chairman Mosbacher, is Kay Bailey Hutchison. I immigrated from Egypt when I was very young, 5 years old. My family immigrated to Dallas, leaving from a small Coptic Christian community. I didn't speak English. I learned English quickly because I was young. Texan took me a lot longer. And, my parents just instilled a love of this country, early on. I went to the University of Texas, and to pay for college, I was a part-time waitress and a part-time staff assistant in the state Senate, and I got to know Senator Hutchison. I'd never seen such a senior woman in Texas politics, to be honest. And she said, you should come intern. When you graduate, you should come intern for me. Come to Washington. I said, oh, my parents would kill me. And she said, why? I said, because growing up, they only had one sentence with all of the girls. We left our homeland, we left our church, we left our friends, so the three of you girls could pursue your dreams, be anything you want to be, as long as you're a lawyer, a doctor, or an engineer. And I said, I got into law school, I have to go. And she said, well, I'll write a letter to the law school and saying it can be deferred. And I said, you don't understand. Anyway, sure enough, my dad said, I don't even know why I left Egypt. He didn't totally get it. But that obviously put me on a trajectory that I never would have come to Washington. I never would have had the honor of having the chance to serve in the way that I did. And she just saw something. I mean, I have no idea why she picked me, but it changed my life.
It's fantastic.
Yeah, for me, I had that football coach. Yeah, I had a professor. So I graduated from West Point. I was an engineer. I always say Mike Pompeo and I had a lot in common. He was first in his class. I was 501st. And so, but after the Army, I get out of the Army, I actually got into Princeton. And I think partially because I'd been a military person, I decided to leave the Army. And I had this professor who is a well-known guy named Richard Ullman. He had been on the New York Times editorial board and was just a very thoughtful guy. I took his foreign policy course. And I got my first paperback, and it had just, you read through the paper, it had in lead pencil A, and then you go a little further, B. And you go through the whole alphabet, and you're going along the paper, double A, double B. And then you get to the end of the paper, and you turn, and there's typed comments. every letter has a comment, which he essentially shredded the paper. You know, the logic's bad, the writing's bad. I mean, it was just, and I was just dumbfounded. And he did that on every paper. The comments were longer than the paper. And for whatever reason, he took a liking to me, and he helped me, and I learned to write. And then he encouraged me to do a PhD, which I did, and he became one of my advisors, and we became squash partners. And through that, and he's long gone now, but through that, my ability to write and think and my logic, and I was not very confident about my intellectual ability. And he said, you should apply for a PhD. I said, I don't think I'm that person. I don't think I have it. He goes, you can do it. And so he encouraged me to do it. I got into the PhD program, and I succeeded in large part because he took such an interest. And that really changed my trajectory.
He's what we call a serial mentor, which you know Richard Allman. I think Clay Johnson was a serial mentor. Gene Johnson Phillips. You know, there are people that really have one story after another of somebody that their legacy, I think, is investing in those people. That's their life's legacy, which is a pretty extraordinary one.
Dick Allman had mentored Dave Petraeus.
Wow. Yeah.
I got to know him through that. He had mentored Tony Lake.
Wow.
So a long line of people that you would know, and it made all the difference.
Fred Malik was also someone like that.
Yeah.
Long
For my
line.
brother, Fred was my brother's mentor.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes, that's right. There is one person that believed in both of me and Dave, and he's here today, and that's Matt Bauer from HarperCollins. Thank you for believing in us, Matt. We're really, really grateful.
Yeah.
Well, thanks to both of you for putting this wonderful book together, and thanks for sharing this conversation with us. And Matt, thank you for publishing their wonderful book. Right. And now we're going to break, go upstairs. We've got copies of the book and a chance for you to sign them, and everybody have a little more conversation. So thank you all.
Thank you
Thank
so
you.
much. Thank you, Fred.
Thanks for listening to this week's Afterwards podcast. If you are interested in podcasts about nonfiction books, listen to C-SPAN's Book Notes Plus podcast for interviews with authors and historians hosted by Brian Lamb.